Hello, and welcome to this fourth and final panel of the Constitution Unit's 2024 conference. I'm Lisa James, I'm a research fellow at the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing this discussion. Our topic is reform of the House of Lords. Whether and how the second chamber should be reformed is a recurring question in constitutional debate, and the parties have taken the opportunity to offer answers in their manifestos. Labour proposes a two-stage reform process. Among other things, the first stage includes removing the remaining hereditary peers, reforming the appointments process, and introducing a retirement age of 80. Their proposed second stage is to replace the Lords with a new second chamber that's more representative of the nations and regions, with more precise proposals to be consulted on. The Conservatives are silent on the topic, but other parties want to go further, with the Liberal Democrats, Greens, SNP and Reform UK all advocating major reforms, typically either replacement or abolition. But what are the pros and cons of all these proposals? What might implementation look like? And what, if anything, is missing from these ideas? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by a fantastic panel. Our speakers are Professor Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit. You can find Meg's most recent analysis of this topic on our blog as part of our series Analysing the Manifestos, or on the Hansard Society podcast. Helene Hayman, Baroness Hayman, a former MP, Crossbench peer and former Lord Speaker. And Darren Hughes, Chief Executive of the Electoral Reform Society and a former member of the New Zealand House of Representatives. And apologies come from Baroness Deach, who was originally due to be on this panel but is no longer able to join us. Each of our panelists is going to speak for around 5 minutes. After that, the four of us will have a brief panel discussion and then we'll open up to audience questions. So if you have a question, you can submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Hannah Kelly, who's here on screen, will select from among them and put the questions to the panel. By default, she'll also share the questioner's name, but you can submit your question anonymously if you prefer. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded, so you may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether or not to use your name in your question. We'll be posting a video of this whole session shortly afterwards, and we'll also make the event available via our podcast. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Meg.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much to the other panelists for being here, and indeed to the audience for being here. We agreed between us as a panel that in the opening remarks, I think Helene and I are probably both going to stick to the small potential first stage Labour proposals, which those small scale proposals only come from Labour. And then I think Darren is going to talk about the potential second stage of Labour and the more ambitious proposals from other parties, which rather echo it. And what I want to focus on primarily is a bit which has been rather less noticed than the eye-catching retirement age of 80 or removal of the hereditary peers. What I think in Labour's first stage of reform is probably the most crucial bit in the manifesto, the promise to reform the appointments process to ensure the quality of new appointments. That's a small number of words, and it's interesting to reflect on what they might mean and what they ideally should mean. I think the most obvious minimalist interpretation of this commitment is something which is in line with the, and apologies for the plug, but the joint statement that we issued on ethics standards with two other organisations yesterday, with the Institute for Government and the Grieve Commission, which I'm just putting our statement in the chat, because we focus on the role of the House of Lords Appointments Commission and how it could be strengthened. And so that the minimalist approach, I think, is to do what that statement called for, which is to first of all say that the House of Lords Appointments Commission's recommendations on propriety cannot be overridden by the Prime Minister. We did see that from Boris Johnson on one appointee, and there are rumours of other arguments behind the scenes. So if the new Prime Minister would pledge to listen to the House of Lords Appointments Commission, that would be a great step forward. Secondly, to extend the House of Lords Appointments Commission's remit to look at not just propriety, but also the suitability of new appointees. This is something that people have been talking about for years. The House of Lords Appointments Commission's remit is rather narrow. It only considers essentially, whether people's tax affairs are in order, what their criminal situation is. It doesn't look at whether they're going to be a useful contributor to the chamber, whether they're going to be active, whether they bring benefits to the chamber. And there have been obviously questions about the suitability of some people appointed in recent years. So those extensions would be very, very welcome, and I hope are on the agenda. They could all be implemented straight away, simply by the Prime Minister making an announcement that this is the way he wants to do things in future. although it would be beneficial to underpin them with legislation just to ensure that these things are stuck to by future prime ministers. And indeed, even the prime minister after this election doesn't change their mind and go back on their proposals. But if you look at the words in the manifesto, there is another phrase which is interesting in terms of reforming appointments, which is that they will seek to improve the national and regional balance in the second chamber. That's not the, they say that as part of the elected part of the reforms. They also say that in relation to appointments, which I thought was very interesting. It suggests that they want to go further in terms of giving the House of Lords Appointments Commission maybe some kind of control over diversity in the chamber, which again, I think would be a very welcome change to try and ensure that the House of Lords properly reflects all parts of the country. And perhaps if you're doing that, why not look at other aspects of diversity, the most obvious one being gender balance. I don't think this means that the House of Lords Appointments Commission is going to start making the choices about who everybody is. I think that would be a very big step away from the party leaders and Prime Minister choosing who the political appointees are. But I certainly think that you could do sensible things going further with the House of Lords Appointments Commission monitoring, producing reports and indications of how the balance is going, and maybe making suggestions to the political parties that we don't have enough people from certain parts of the country. You're down on, you're not appointing enough women, so could we have some more women, please? And just making that transparent would be a real improvement. But to go further than some of the most obvious things implied by the manifesto, the most important aspect of balance of all is party balance. And if we're improving the quality of appointments and wanting a properly diverse chamber, then I do think we need to get away from the situation where the Prime Minister can appoint as many as they want from their party with no kind of proper control over the share of seats between the political parties. The manifesto does include the words that the second chamber of Parliament has become too big. I suspect we would all agree with that. It's at around 800. And the reason that it's become too big is primarily because prime ministers have been putting too many people in there. David Cameron over-appointed to the House of Lords. The Lord Speaker, Lord Fowler, set up a committee on the size of the House of Lords to make recommendations on this, which were pretty sensible. And then Boris Johnson really flouted those recommendations. So I think we need to go back to those questions in terms of approving appointments. The Lord Speaker's Committee, chaired by Terry Burns, recommended that there should be a maximum size of the House of Lords of 600. And we should be moving to a system whereby vacancies occur and are filled by the parties. So if there's sufficient space, there'll be an invitation to nominate, and those seats will be shared out fairly according to a party balance formula. The Constitution Unit has done a little bit of public opinion poll work on this, and I'm going to stick that, I think, I hope, in the chat now as well, where we found that there's absolutely overwhelming support for the House of Lords being no bigger than the House of Commons. So 65% of people thought it should be no bigger than the House of Commons. Only 3% thought it should remain uncapped. So this would be a popular move. So in terms of sorting out appointments, I would say the size of the House needs to be fixed. We need to move to a system of nominations to fill vacancies, and we need to have a fair formula for filling those vacancies. There are some things in the Labour manifesto on size. They do mention the problem of size, and we may come on and talk about those things perhaps a bit later, the retirement age of 80 and the removal of the hereditary peers. But I think it's really important to emphasise that the House of Lords is not primarily too big because of a failure of people to leave. It's too big because the prime ministers have consistently put too many people in. And until you do something about the way in, the likelihood is that the place will continue to be too large. And indeed, the retirement age of 80 could even have a perverse incentive in it to put people in who are yet very young and are likely to be there for decades, if there isn't a clear appointments formula to ensure that when people leave, they will be replaced and their parties will not be disadvantaged. On the other points, I think I'll leave those to the discussion and to others. I would say the hereditary peers going is an overdue reform. The retirement age is a slightly surprising thing to have seen in the manifesto and has caused some controversy. And the longer term reform, which I think Darren will talk about, is very interesting. And I'm keen to engage in discussion on that later, but that's more than enough from me.
Great, thank you very much, Meg. Some really interesting stuff there for us to pick up on later. But for now, Helen, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I suppose everything that I say ought to start with the caveat that I am a 75-year-old member of the House of Lords. Under the Labour proposals, it's really interesting. If the next general election takes place before the 26th of March 2029, I will be out. I will be able to stay until 2034. If it takes place after the 26th of March, if we go the full 5 years, I'm out. And I think that is a small reflection on the fact that when you think you introduce something simply as a simple cut-off date, 80 and you're out, it doesn't actually work quite like that. And the other thing that worries me, maybe I'll go straight into my anxieties about retirement age. They stem from my overall objective in regard to the House of Lords, because no one, I think, is suggesting unicameralism in their manifestos. So my overall and strategic objective is that we should have, Patrick called, we should have an effective second chamber, and one that complements the work of the House of Commons. And for me, as someone who doesn't support a directly elected chamber, it's also important that the House of Lords should have some respect and some legitimacy that comes from two things: the quality of the work that it does, and from the transparency and justification of the appointments system. And I think some of what Meg was talking about plays very much to that. The reason I put that in the context of retirement age is that I think we are way too big. I absolutely endorse what Meg was saying about, again, let's get back to principles. We want a smaller house. If we knew what the task was in terms of reducing the size of the house, and this was what Terry Burns took on with his committee, then you look at the way of achieving that. And as Meg says, it's not only what you put into the bucket, it's what the holes are like at the bottom of the bucket. And whether one of those holes, 80, an age restriction, is actually compatible with my strategic objective about having an effective second chamber that does the best possible quality work, something I worry about, because without speaking ad hominem too much, I think if you look at the concerns about the contributions of people in the House of Lords, the concerns often about behaviour, reasons for appointment, etc., suitability, actually having the time to contribute or the willingness or the capacity to contribute, those don't just occur with people over 80. And on the other hand, we can all look at plenty of people in the over a decade since he was 80, the contribution that Alf Dubs has made to parliamentary and political life is, I know, anecdotal, exemplar, but actually it's not a single example. And one of the things that a second chamber can bring is that sort of corporate memory. So I am nervous around cut-off, hard, age-related cut-off dates. Age is a protected characteristic, after all, and we ought to just think very carefully about that. I also worry that it doesn't reduce the numbers quickly enough. Back to my point about people who get 80 during the course of the Parliament. Of course, getting rid of the hereditaries takes a block away. It has absolutely no justification. I have to say, on an individual basis, there are lots of people that will be sad to lose. And there are people who have come in very recently. And I think one of the mistakes and what we've got to look at in this round of changes is the hereditary by-elections was a terrible mistake. In one way, it was fine. It stopped a year of Parliament Act. In another way, it's created this huge problem since 1999. And we're dealing with 92 people now. We would have been dealing with really a very small number of people if we hadn't had the by-elections. So I take from that we ought to make this first round of changes as powerful as we can. Meg, you said they were small. This was the small change. At the time, the 1958 Act was, of course, thought of as a very small change. It had enormous impact. And then the 1999 change, we thought was very big, but turned out not to be as big as we thought, partly. There's 92 hereditaries we've still got. So I think getting it right and doing it as well as we can is really important now. I do think a lot of this comes back to the prerogative, and I think we have to face up to that and look at curbing the powers of the Prime Minister. There have been 29 direct ministerial appointments since 2010. Those are people who have come in directly as ministers. I mean, ironically, of course, that's how David Cameron came in, most recently, having made those sorts of appointments himself. Some of them, of course, have been very successful, but an awful lot of them, we have seen people come in, do a ministerial job for 6, 9, 12 months, and then be a member of the House of Lords for life. And I do think we might look seriously in this smaller package about those sorts of appointments being time limited in some way, because I actually prefer the system of term appointments to the system of hard age limits, in terms of making sure that you have the best people available. And that, again, goes back to my concerns about the hard stop at 80. Actually, when the 92 hereditary peers who were to stay on were selected, in the main, almost entirely, the right people were chosen to stay on, the best 10% or whatever it was of the hereditaries. And that was done because it was done through the parties, and it was done by people who understood the contribution that was being made. So that's a long-winded way of saying that as far as the age limit is concerned, I worry that it won't give us the highest quality membership able to do the best job within the Lords. And And I think the only other thing I would say is that, going back to the Appointments Commission, I really do think there is scope for the Appointments to Commission to take on much more of that role about diversity, regional representation, and that, as Meg said, you can do it without them choosing who are the political appointees, but very much directing and showing the direction of travel in terms of the diversity within the House, where geographical issues are really important and we need to make sure there's a way of addressing them. I think, therefore, that we want to go beyond simply extending their role about appointments, absolutely crucial though it is that they should give proper scrutiny to political appointees. But if they're going to have more of these institutional responsibilities about the institution as a whole, if we're going to give them more responsibilities about the proportionality of different political groups within the House, then I do think that a statutory basis is really important for that. So I would hope that we could persuade an incoming government that it was important, as we've argued and had in private members' bills and all sorts of things for a long time, that we had a statutory Appointments Commission. I think maybe I'll stop there because there'll be lots of things to talk about. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm really quite excited about this. One has been a broken record on reforming the House of Lords without the issues that Darren and I have debated only recently in many fora. I do think there's opportunities now, and I do think what actually I did say to Nick Clegg at the time, that if you believe in a completely different setup and an elected chamber or a completely differently composed chamber, there's a lot to be said for getting the House of Lords down to a sensible size with some appropriate mechanisms and taking away some of the absolute downers as far as the public is concerned, and getting a House of Lords with a proper remit in parliamentary terms, because, you know, all this debate we're having about what's the opposition going to be, how are we going to make sure that a government, if it does have a large majority, is properly challenged and scrutinised. House of Lords is very much part of that. And I think getting that role and that dealing with some of these really irritating, difficult things that the public finds very difficult to take, you know, how did they get their questions, is really important and will sort of clear the decks for the next stage of debate, which we might take different opinions.
Great, thank you very much, Helene. And I think Darren is about to lead us on to that next stage of debate.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Just maybe starting there with Helen gave us a magic date in 2029, and maybe in this current political environment, we should take a 5-minute break and go to the betting shop to lay odds on the 2029 election date for that measure. But I think there's a lot of agreement on some of these topics, and I really do agree that there's something refreshing about talking about this right now, because I think a lot of the discussion in these last few years has felt kind of almost a sense of anger that nothing's really changing and bad practices were carrying on. It does feel as though we are going to get some meaningful changes now that we can get our teeth stuck into and maybe iron out some of the differences that there have been, and agree some of the areas that can either be immediately worked on or thought through further. And I've got a feeling that this is going to be a much more engaging discussion, and so I'm really glad that this has come up this side of the election for us to speak about. I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge, though, is that this is a very tough institution to reform. Because it does have a long history, and it does have an important purpose, but it's also increasingly full of some big personalities, and there's always a reason why we've got to wait for the next change to come along. So, in the sense of the two-stage steps that Labor is talking about, I can kind of see why they've tried to put some intention of seriousness at the beginning. And I agree with what Meg said. I think if the age limit is left to stay for a long time, we'll end up in a situation where prime ministers are incentivized to appoint very young people. You know, we just know that these things that are chosen for one reason often take on a life of their own. So I think what we have to hope is that they are serious about change, and that's why they want to show immediately that they're taking that seriously. But the pressure has to stay on to make sure that we do move to that second stage. It's worth noting the impact on Labor is much higher of the age limit, because a bigger proportion of their number would be affected by the age limit. And of course, there are a lot of Labor people who have faithfully served on the benches for 14 years of opposition who might not want to continue, but because of the prime ministerial appointment being so out of whack these last few years, might have felt the pressure to stay. So I think there's going to be a lot of dynamics that move around personnel, and that presents a challenge for an incoming prime minister, because if there is a desire to appoint a lot of new people to help with the government's program, how do we not let history repeat itself? And in 3 or 4 years' time, people have got used to being in there and now see, yes, I did come originally to help the new government, but I've now taken on these new causes and I see this project. So I think we've got to really keep the pressure on for reform on these kind of structural points, while at the same time having some probably higher level conceptual points about what the institution is meant to do. And I find these two areas quite exciting for us to be thinking about. The hereditaries doesn't require any comment from me. I agree with that. It is the end of a quarter-century transition period, which just emphasises the point we're all making about how, unless we keep the feet to the fire, things take a long time. So I guess if I just had a couple of minutes talking about what that next step might look like, I think from the point of view of a campaigning organisation like ours that tries to take a voter's standpoint about what these things mean, I think it's a real chance to think about the aspects of the House of Lords that works really well and that we would want to keep, and then where some of the new areas have developed that there needs to be maybe some new territory that needs to be explored. And the most obvious one, it seems to me, is that if Labor do come back to government, after a decade and a half nearly away from the Treasury benches, they inherit a much different devolved settlement than the one that they started off at the end of the 90s and left government in 2010. The Welsh Assembly is now the Senate. The Scottish Parliament at Holyrood has far more powers than it did when it was set up. Stormont, of course, the issues are well canvassed there. And we've seen it within England, the mayoral devolution model, the city deals, lots of different devolution of powers to town and city halls. So it's a different type of devolution that Labor, who might think of themselves as being the people who started this off, are coming back to. And how that fits into a second chamber is actually quite an interesting question. And it does bring up maybe new areas that we need to explore around direct election, indirect elections, how to include more voices. And probably that's where the Gordon Brown Commission report would be a good place to start. I know a lot of people have looked at it, say it needs much further thinking and examination, but it's at least a place to start. And if Labor are putting down that marker that it's a two-step solution, two-step process that they want to follow, then that might be a set of ideas to have a discussion around when they get to that. I think the critical thing about how seriously Labor is taking democratic reform, including the House of Lords, but much broader than that, is what style they want to take, and including the public. And I think that's a really important point, that it has felt with all these appointments of political contacts and junior staffers getting lifetime jobs, and the sense that the Liz Truss resignation list, the public view on that was so strongly against it, it made no difference whatsoever. I think that it's got to not be a rarefied discussion. It's got to be able to find mechanisms to include the public about where power lies and how the new devolution settlement will work with a more democratically involved second chamber. So I think those are some of the things that we need to look at. There'll be no disagreement, obviously, on size, but I think there is new areas around territorial issues that need to be looked at. And probably, without reopening all the Brexit discussions, a sense that does a second chamber have a stronger role in looking after constitutional norms as well? And so those are things that I feel we'll now have the time to get into, rather than just a focus on who's been appointed most recently and how big has it become. But I do close by saying we've got to not be too complacent about the opportunity that exists, because the status quo has a great way of maintaining itself, hence the term. And I think that unless we really keep focused on changes that are needed, we'll be rereading the preamble of the 1911 Parliament Act, which referred to the House of Lords as a temporary arrangement. And I think we really want to make some positive changes and start to turn around those very worrying figures in the most recent British Social Attitude Survey about how people see democracy and trust in institutions. So let's make this a positive discussion that begins to turn the page on some of the things that I think we all agree have been unacceptable in recent years.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Darren. I can see we have some great audience questions coming in already, but do keep them coming. We're going to have a discussion among the panel for maybe 20 minutes or so. So you have plenty more time to formulate your questions, and then we'll come to the audience Q&A. But before we do that, let me kick off by asking Meg and Helene in particular, but anyone should feel free to chip in on any of these. What kind of reception do you think Labour's proposals are likely to get in the House of Lords itself? How are people likely to feel about these proposals on an age cap, on ending the role of the hereditary peers? Do you foresee opposition, or do you think some of this will be welcomed? Helene, you're still on mute.
Mixed. I think, listen, the House of Lords voted nemine dissentiente, with no one disagreeing, that it wanted a cap on its size. Okay? I don't think the ends of reducing the size of the House will be in any way opposed. I think inevitably there will be a rearguard action about the hereditaries, but until now we've never had a manifesto commitment about whether this was stage 2. Maybe stage 1 of a new government, but it is stage 2 of the 1999 with a manifesto commitment behind it. So, as I say, I think there will be, both from individuals who are affected and from other people, a bit of a sense of sadness, unfairness, these people are contributing as much as anybody else. If donors and clapped out old politicians can come into the House of Lords, these people at least went through some sort of selection process. But I don't see a huge institutional push against that, because it does take the numbers down and provide a bit of headroom. As I think it was Darren said, the Labour Party is badly affected by the age issue. There are a lot of people who have stayed on and who need to make room. An incoming Labour government, if that's what we have, is going to want to make new appointments. I think the hard stop at 80 may well have quite a bit of pushback. If Meg and I were talking the other day, and we were talking about maybe looking at a sooner augmentation for an older age. I still think you should look at term limits and how long people have served. So it could be either an age and length of service. I think there will be, if not pushback, certainly debate about those issues. And I think in terms of strengthening the appointment process, which is in many ways at the heart of this, I don't think there'll be pushback from the House of Lords at all, because I think the majority of the people in the House of Lords have felt deeply distressed by the opprobrium that is attached to the institution as a whole and to them as members of it by some of the practices and the appointments practices of recent governments.
Yes, I was going to say something very similar to what Helene just said. My starting point would be, I think it's really important to get across to people that the main thing that has prevented reform in the past has not been the House of Lords. It's very easy to say that the House of Lords is resistant to reform, but actually most packages of reform, you can go back to Harold Wilson in the 1960s, Labour after 1997, Nick Clegg in 2012. It's in the House of Commons that proposals for radical Lords reform tend to fall apart, not in the House of Lords. So it's important not to brand the House of Lords blockers. And I agree with Helene completely that some people in the House of Lords are crying out for reform. They're crying out for improvements to the appointments process, for example. And I realise that I failed to acknowledge the fact that both Darren and Helene very kindly signed the letter that we had published in the Times in support of our statement to improve the appointments process to allow HOLAC to have some control over quality as well as propriety, and for its recommendations to be required to be followed by the Prime Minister. I think on some of the other things, it is valid for the House of Lords to take an interest in changes directly to it. And the problem with the size of 80, I think, is that it sort of arrived from nowhere. Nobody was talking about this. I mean, there's a community of people who talk about Lords reform and what the next steps are endlessly and try and encourage governments to take action. I mean, the question on the hereditary peers is very, very familiar because Bruce Grocott, again, a member of the House of Lords, has been trying for years and years and years to end the hereditary by-elections. The pressure on that has been going on for about 20 years, really, literally, since almost immediately it happened. So that's a sign that the House of Lords does want incremental reform. He couldn't get it through because it's a private member's bill and a few hereditary peers can block it. But the House of Lords in general has wanted that change too. But I think it would have been nicer to have something in the manifesto saying the House of Lords is too big. We're determined to make the House of Lords smaller. We are going to enter discussions as to how to do that, and we will come up with a solution and we will bash it through and be really determined about that, but actually have a listening phase. Because I agree with Helene that if the House of Lords itself had been asked how to do this, it would have come up with some other proposals. And I think there might have been a fairly kind of consensual way of proceeding by, as happened in 1999, the party groups being invited to reduce their number and them choosing the people who they felt were less useful to the chamber to go and keeping on other people, some people who might have been older, to stay. I think a compromise around, as Helene said, I said this on the Hansard podcast, the idea that you might say, well, let's not do 80 in the future, let's do 85 now, would have the benefit that 85 looks a little bit more palatable perhaps, but also that it would have an effect now, because this isn't going to have an effect for 4 or 5 years on the size. And I think many of us want change on the size right now. The other thing which I think Helene, if I remember rightly, is quite keen on is the idea of fixed terms. Moving to fixed terms, which was one of the things that the Burns Committee proposed. Now, obviously, the people who've been appointed have been appointed. We're not going to change their terms. But if you think about the Burns Committee proposed a fixed term of 15 years, that actually acts as a disincentive to appoint people too young, because if Charlotte Owen had been appointed at 30, she would have been out at 45, whereas a lot of people arrive at something more like, say, 67, the standard retirement age, and that would have had them leaving at 82. So I think there are quite a lot of options around how to shrink the size and do it in a rational way. I just think the politics around this retirement age of 80 are a bit unfortunate. And it would be a shame to have a row with the House of Lords on its reform, but I do think it should be listened to a little bit in terms of whether there are some compromises available.
Okay, great, thank you. Darren, did you want to come in on that topic?
Just to say on the fixed term, I mean, I think that makes the most sense. It was also the 15-year was also the proposal on the Clegg legislation for a single term. And I think, you know, there's often this discussion about, well, obviously, if you are looking at it through the lens of an elected or a large elected component, the discussion always turns to, well, you know, there's a legitimacy issue. Do they try, one chamber tries to outdo the other, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that if you have single long terms, it takes it out of the electoral cycle. A mandate either comes through an improved appointment process for now, maybe in the future from a democratic mandate to start, but then no one's running for re-election or reappointment, so they can focus on doing a very good job over a long period of time, and that would help to manage the numbers as well.
Great. Now we should look ahead to the proposed second stage of reform as well, in our final few minutes before we go to the audience. I mean, how much do we know about what Labour might have in mind for its alternative second chamber? There are obviously the recommendations of the Brown Commission, but are there other existing models that the party might want to draw on when it considers a chamber more representative of the nations and regions? And Darren, you mentioned the importance of keeping the pressure on to make sure that second stage of reform does happen. What might the timing around all this look like? Is this do we think this is potentially a second term sort of proposal, or are there things that an incoming government should be thinking about in order to make sure that happens?
I think they need to get thinking and get working on it right away, because I mean, as we just all know, things do take time. There'll be a lot of competing priorities for a new government. We can't miss out the big missing picture here, which is a very difficult, tricky economy, and it's sort of not being talked about a lot in this election, but that will have an impact on the government's ability to do things and what it's prepared to give oxygen to. Great thing about constitutional issues is that they're quite cheap compared to most other projects. So maybe this is worthwhile us pushing up the agenda. But I think that one useful way would be to try and take some of the democratic innovations of the last few years that many organisations and institutions, universities have been trying to promote, which is, how do we get beyond meaningless public consultation where people don't feel as though the form they fill out is taken seriously, but to look at more models like citizens' assemblies, for example, which do bring in randomly selected members of the public, giving them the time and space to look at a topic, hear expert views, deliberate with one another. We've had a lot of examples of these in the last few years to build up the body of evidence that this is a good way of helping to make a decision, not replacing anyone else, but just to help be a tool for coming to a final view or a final decision about a topic. And it seems to me that something like this, where you'd be trying to thinking about the future of the union, really, about how the union has changed so much. Here's something that's an institution at Westminster, and it can't simply be a question of saying let's keep it exactly the same as it is, either change what the Prime Minister can do or elect everybody and carry on. There are some things where the public could have some involvement, and I would have thought that because that would take time of itself, they should be doing that as they consider fleshing out some of the big questions that sat there in the Brown Commission report.
Now, Meg, you've written about the Brown Commission report and some of the proposals in there, and have thought a lot about how this stacks up in comparative terms. What are your views on this question of territorial representation in the second chamber and the things that Labour should be thinking about?
Well, you're quite right, Lisa. I have looked at this comparatively, and there are lots of second chambers around the world that use a kind of territorial model. I mean, the most famous one to most people in the UK probably is the US Senate, which has 2 representatives per state, irrespective of population. You see something similar in Australia, and in many other countries around the world, there are models along those lines. In terms of where we look for models, Darren mentioned the Clegg proposals, the bill proposed by Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg in the early years of the coalition, which was to introduce elections on a regional basis, informed by some of the international experience. And the peculiar thing about the Clegg proposals were they were actually very similar to the proposals that had been brought forward under the Brown government when Labour was in power, and yet when they were introduced into the House of Commons, Labour had all sorts of problems with them, which I think illustrates my point that it's the House of Commons that often slows these things up. But Darren also was very sensible when he said earlier as well that the devolution settlement has changed a lot. So we can't necessarily go back to those proposals from that period, but we have a very, very complicated devolution settlement. I mean, at our session at this conference yesterday, we were hearing about English devolution, which is the most complicated of all. But of course, the powers and functions of the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly are not the same. Big bits of England, you know, nowhere in England has devolved powers to that level. Bits of England have no devolution at all. This is a very, very complex settlement to capture in a second chamber compared to, say, the US or Australia, where you have more or less symmetrical devolution. They wouldn't even call it devolution, but, you know, symmetrical federalism everywhere. So I completely agree with Darren. And this is one of the things I said in response to the Brown Commission report. And it's good to hear it from Darren, because I don't think anybody can accuse Darren of wanting to kick the can down the road. You know, he's serious about change. I think a lot of people in Labour are serious about change, but this does need proper thinking through, and it needs involvement of people out there in the different component parts of the UK to actually buy into a new arrangement. And that's not going to be easy to do.
Helen, let me give you the last word on this before we go to the audience in a couple of minutes.
When I was Lord Speaker and talking about the House of Lords, I always used to say that second chambers are like Tolstoyan unhappy families. First chambers, lower houses, are all straightforward, representation by population, happy families. Second chambers differ enormously, and they're usually the products of political geography or political history. We're political history in spades, yeah? But political geography is much easier to accommodate in a second chamber in a straightforward fashion, in the sort of examples that Meg has just given. But also in Europe, if you look at Germany, federal states, you can see that there's a sort of model there for how you do it. It is much more complicated, I think, in the UK, and quite how you deal with the English problem, or the fact that the Scottish settlement is different from the Northern Ireland settlement in terms of a second chamber and the weighting of representation in that, I think, is really difficult. It also, of course, brings in some of my problems about election, but I'll put that to one side. I do think, in terms of the sort of consultation we need, what we don't need is another Royal Commission, because, you know, that did not end up providing any sort of consensus. So I do think we need to be more imaginative about what we talk to people about. And it's certainly, and this is one of the things that I would be hopeful for, was that if we do the first stage well and have a House of Lords that is working better on an appointed basis, we might be able to win that particular argument, or at least it would be an option that it was legitimate to consider. The one thing no one has mentioned, but which audiences, when you talk about the House of Lords, really like, is indirect election. They like the idea of a House of Lords that has people from the scientific community and the arts community and doctors and academics and a whole range of organisations. Now, it's horribly difficult to think how those organisations would provide their representation. But of course, in terms of national governments or the Scottish Parliament or the city regions, you can see, and again, some second chambers do this, have indirectly elected membership who come from regions or localities. So I just put that into the mix.
Great, thank you. I would love to keep going. I think we could keep going for much longer just between us, but I can see we have lots of questions coming in from the audience. So why don't we bring Hannah back on screen to tell us what the audience have for us.
Hello, everyone. We've got a few questions here. One from David Nartzler, who said, if the proposed Labour bill has at least two purposes, it will be open to wide amendment in the Commons, a tempting target for numbers of Labour backbenchers to rebel with Lib Dem and SNP support. Do people think, firstly, that the bishops will survive? And secondly, would either a fiercer retirement regime, such as a fixed age, or term appointments be agreed? Megan Manson asked, why have no manifestos mentioned the obvious issue of the 26 bishops appointed to the House of Lords simply by virtue of being Anglican bishops? And John Newham asked, should the remaining hereditary peers be converted to life peers?
Okay, so agreement on exit terms, the future of the bishops, and whether some of the hereditary should become life peers. Meg, do you want to take that first?
Well, of course, for context, David Nartzler is a former clerk of the House of Commons. When he talks about bills and how they can be amended, we need to take it seriously. And this does chime with something that I've been thinking, that we can ask ourselves what's likely to be in Labour's bill. I get the impression they want to act on the hereditaries very quickly, and getting rid of the hereditary peers would require a bill. So that quite likely means a bill in the first term. So we can ask ourselves what should be in it. And my advice to them would be, the more bits you put in it, the more trouble it's going to get into, which is exactly what David, I think, is alluding to. I think if you put the retirement age in with the hereditaries, you're obviously walking into an argument. We've already seen some of the concerns in the House of Lords on that. And in fact, given that the retirement age is not going to apply for a few years anyway, I'm not sure whether having that argument in the first term is really going to be a good use of parliamentary time. So I think my advice would be stick with the hereditary peers and putting the House of Lords Appointments Commission on a statutory basis, which pretty much everybody agrees on. Those are fairly unarguable things. There will be some arguments about the hereditary peers. And in answer to John's question, I think this was touched on by Helene when she spoke. She referred to the compromise whereby the 92 stayed as a terrible mistake in retrospect. And I think there's a lesson there as to people who say, well, we should compromise on the hereditary peers. So, if you get rid of 92, maybe we should only get rid of 70 or something. I think this is the time when we have to say the end of the hereditary principle applying to the UK Parliament is going to end. It's no disrespect to the people many of whom are very, very good contributors to the Lords, but I think it is reputationally damaging that we have a Parliament which can be pointed to and said how old-fashioned it is. It's got hereditary people in it. But I do agree with John Newham that a sensible compromise might be to give at least some of the hereditary peers who are the most valuable contributors life peerages, so that we can say it's a chamber that no longer includes anybody by virtue of birthright. And that would be I think that would be a relatively benign compromise compared to maybe whittling them down forever, so that in 100 years we're saying, should we get rid of the remaining 3 hereditary peers?
Thank you. Helene, let me come to you next. Oh, I think you've just muted yourself.
Sorry. Having fought through battles on numerous, what we thought were very limited House of Lords reforms bills, I had one, David Steele had it 2, 3 times, I can't remember, Bruce's bill. The scope for amendment is a really serious issue, because Darren said something earlier that one of the advantages of constitutional reform was that it's cheap. which is absolutely correct in one way. One thing that never occurred to me before I became a minister, and which I learned very quickly, was that in government, legislative time is as precious a commodity as Treasury funding in some ways. And the amount of legislative time that a government is willing to give to long drawn out debates on the intricacies of limited reform to the House of Lords, which is something, that does make me get up in the morning, and probably the rest of the panel and many of the people who are listening. But I have to say, we have to recognise we're in a minority in terms of it being positively something that people really want to see a huge amount of government time taken up with. So I think there is a real danger there, and we need some wisdom. I absolutely agree on hereditary peers with Meg. We can't just end the by-elections now. We could have just ended the by-elections right at the beginning 20 years ago. We can't do that now. I think it would be right and proper, probably, for some of those who lose their seats to become, through a proper appointment process, nomination and appointment process, life peers, because frankly, they're extremely valuable. It may say, I always find saying the Duke of Wellington did so-and-so, an odd sentence to say in 2024. But actually, if you look at what the Duke of Wellington did in terms of cleaning up our rivers and holding government to account, the problem with the House of Lords is it produces lots of exceptions to lots of rules about how you feel about things and people. Just one thing on the bishops is rather like that. I would like to see a settlement where we dramatically reduce the numbers of bishops. That's a compromise that I think I probably would make, certainly for stage one of reform. And I think the bishops would probably buy into that, rather than take on the whole of the church-state debate, which would be opened up by getting rid of the bishops completely, and counterbalancing that with what actually already happens, with making sure that the Appointments Commission within its remit include faith diversity in its remit of looking at the diversity of the House as a whole.
And Darren.
Thanks. I think David's question points to two things really. One's the practicality, and I agree that the oxygen that legislative time, that's the political currency, and any legislation, there's only so much of it to go around, and there will be a temptation to include all sorts of other democratic constitutional questions, voter ID, what's happened to the Electoral Commission, any early decisions on party funding or arrangements on this. So you could see if they added in too many things, then people who don't want to see one of the things happen develop a sudden interest in other aspects of it in order to slow it down. So I think keeping things as simple as possible is generally a good rule. But I think it does kind of point to a much broader philosophical point that we should acknowledge more often than we do, and that the political world is one of the few parts of life that essentially gets to regulate itself and come up with its own industry rules. And that's why I think that things take so long, because the same people who are running the process are also directly affected by the outcome of it. So when you think about ministers reforming other industries, they might consult, they might listen, but at some stage someone says, thank you for all this information, stop talking, we're making a decision, this is another law, this is another regulation. But in the political world, there's no one left to regulate politicians. And I think that's why we have to be, there's no getting around that, but it's worth just keeping in our thought, because that's how you get a situation where people take undue interest in talking out Bruce Grocot's bill, for example, because it directly affected them. Not many other people working in an industry about to be changed by the government or by Parliament have that kind of privilege. So I think it's just worth us bearing in mind that. On the hereditary peers, I wouldn't be in favour of that, because I think there's already been this exceptionally long transition time, with the transition time turbocharged by the by-election, which is a form of transition in itself. And I think then converting them or creating another process to convert to a lifetime thing just feels as though it's taken it too far. I think that it can't be that the next government has as its major achievement, if it gets derailed, finishing off the last government's House of Lords process. I think we've got to be more hopeful than that. And I think going forward, it's very hard to argue, I think, if we're thinking about it from the voters' point of view, the inclusion of bishops from one church or one part of the union. So I think that's something that definitely should change as well as, that's something that definitely should change as well as part of a reform process.
Great. Meg, you have your hand up to come back in.
Yes, my apologies. I think we're all agreed on this, and I just thought it might be worth putting it more pithily. It would be a tragedy if Labour's bill to do the thing that virtually everybody agrees needs to be done, which is ending the hereditary membership of the House of Lords, and I would suggest putting the House of Lords Appointments Commission on a statutory footing, if that got bogged down in a whole lot of other issues, which caused arguments in the Commons and then greater arguments, this would be craziness. Let us please just get on with the next bit that nobody really opposes, and then think about what comes after that. That I think is very strong advice from this panel to those implementing reform.
Okay. And on that note, Hannah, what more do you have for us?
Well, thinking about what comes after that, Keith Raffin has said, wouldn't the simplest and quickest way of cutting the Lords down to a size of 600 or even 450 be for each party's peers to vote for a number of their colleagues according to the percentage of the vote their party won in the general election? Setting aside crossbench peers, that would mean that, for example, on current polling, Labour would have around 40% of the remainder. Michael Wells said, could the panel please comment on the Sortition Foundation's proposal for a House of Citizens to replace the House of Lords, which would be based on a Professor Alan Rennick style Citizens Assembly? And in a similar vein, but slightly differently, Alistair Binney Lubbock said, would the panel support a Citizens Assembly on Lords reform?
Really interesting. Okay, so we have intra-party elections as a way to cut numbers, the potential for sortition, and the role of a citizens' assembly. Darren, I'll come to you first on these, if I may.
Yeah, I might just pick up the citizens' assembly point there. I think that would be a good fit for working out for canvassing the powers and the role of a second chamber. And adding it would provide a democratic component as well as the elected House of Commons component, plus people who will be commenting from civil society as well to that mix of what it is we want to replace and improve a second chamber for. So I think bringing in that citizens' assembly dimension would be a very positive thing. I'm just conscious
Helene.
of time, so I just took one of them rather than all three.
Perfect. Helene, we'll go to you next.
I'm a fan of citizens' assemblies. I think that in the consultation about what comes next, that would be a good way forward. I'm not in favour of a House of Citizens, if I understand what was being suggested, in the sense that I go back to what is the function of the House of Lords. If you want a completely different function, and in some ways the Brown Committee did want that, fine. To be boring and back to the detail, what the House of Lords does day in, day out is scrutinise and improve legislation. Not most of the time fighting with the government, actually taking bills, great swathes of which have not been looked at in the House of Commons at all, and making sure they're fit for purpose in legislative terms. And I do think you need a combination of skills and backgrounds that is actually chosen or vetted or selected in a particular way to do that job. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be done by the House of Lords. The House of Commons could undertake its scrutiny in a completely different way. But it's a big and important job that the House of Lords does. I talked about legitimacy of output earlier on. And I think if you look at the work of select committees in the Lords, the work they do on legislation and the work that is done in scrutinising and challenging the executive, those are things that are important and shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater. So I do feel strongly about that.
And Meg, we'll give you the final word on these topics.
Well, I think there's total agreement again on the panel on the idea of having a citizens' assembly on Lords reform. I think that's a pretty sensible idea. It's been an intractable topic for as long as I can remember, and a lot longer than that. So getting citizens together to debate the options for House of Lords reform, I think, would be quite a useful thing. It certainly couldn't do any harm. But I agree with Helene on replacing the House of Lords with a citizens' assembly type arrangement. I mean, the House, as is referred to by the Alan Rennick style words in the question, the Constitution Unit has been quite an advocate of citizens' assemblies. We have run several. Alan has been on the, who's the Deputy Director of the unit, has been on the steering committee for many more. We value them. We can very much see their usefulness, but I think that Alan and I are completely in agreement that replacing the House of Lords with a citizens' assembly simply would not work. Citizens' assemblies are not like parliaments. Parliaments have key characteristics, one of which is that they're very public institutions. They're on the record, they're transcribed, they're televised. Citizens' assemblies actually meet in private. They deliberate and they provide a space where people are allowed to change their minds. And that meeting in private is actually one of the things that makes them work. They are complementary to parliamentary assemblies. They're not the same thing. You would also never be able to get a citizens' assembly that was properly representative, where you were plucking people from every bit of the country and telling them that they had to sit in a parliamentary chamber in London for even as much as a year, let alone 5 years. You know, you can't treat the House of Lords like a jury where people do jury service and are wrenched from their families and their jobs and their parts of the country and told to go and sit in London. This is just, it's a fantasy. It's never going to happen. But that isn't to say that Parliament can't make much greater use of citizens' assemblies on particular topics. I think there's a lot more that can be done to involve citizens in deliberative work on policy, but it's not a replacement exercise. I think nobody commented on Keith's question about the party groups voting. And I would say I'm very much on Keith's side in terms of, yes, there are quick ways that you can get the House of Lords down. And yes, I would say go to the parties and get them to choose who ought to stay. And indeed, I wonder whether this might be put to the parties as a sort of slightly, you know, this is going to sound a bit crude, but sort of do it or else. You know, if we park the retirement age for a moment and say to the parties, we're going to leave it to you to cut your numbers. And if you don't, we are going to legislate to do something. That might concentrate minds. I think it would be unfair to make it by percentage of the vote in this most recent election, because clearly the way the polls are, Labour are getting twice the share of the vote that the Conservatives are. And I think that would look biased and harsh and illegitimate. So I think if you did it on some basis of sort of the last several elections, the Burns Committee had a formula which was based on seat shares as well as vote shares. I think the exact formula would be something that would need careful consideration. But I think that the principle of the parties voting to get their numbers down, to shrink the House of Lords ASAP really, is a very sensible one.
Great. Now we have just 5 minutes left. Oh, sorry, Helen, would like to come in?
Well, I just wanted to say that idea of the groups within the House of Lords doing the job themselves of looking at who ought to stay on is the best way of quality control, I think, of the people who are there at the moment. And it's something we've been fighting for. I've been campaigning for, I don't know, a couple of decades. But the only way to do it is, and we've suggested that the leader of the House convene, the other members, blah, blah, blah. Someone has got to say this has to be done. And therefore, I think Meg is right. This has to be a non-negotiable, that it is done with a fair formula for how many people everyone loses, but then you can choose who you lose.
Great. Now, in our final few minutes, Hannah, do you have one final audience question on which we give each of our panelists 30 seconds?
Yes, we've got one from Andrew McCower, who said, Helene said she wants an effective second chamber, but neither she nor Meg have said anything about the House's powers and functions or its relationship with the Commons. Is that because the Cunningham Committee said the last word about the House's powers and functions and how they should stay as they are?
Wonderful. A nice small question to end on. Helene, let's start with you.
Hi, Andrew. There are lots of things and powers and relationships and working relationships that I think we could do much, much better. I would start with statutory instruments, because I think Parliament as a whole needs to look at secondary legislation and how it deals with it. Lots more that we ought to do, but my reticence is around mission creep, which I think we've talked about a lot. We're going to have to take the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, if we're going to achieve anything with this, without it becoming so entangled that we don't achieve anything else.
Wonderful. Darren?
Yes, I think obviously the scrutiny role, the check on the lower chamber, those are things that everyone does agree with. I said at the beginning, there are other things that second chambers do around the world, around territorial interests, minority interests, constitutional protections, etc. So those are things that could come through. And maybe just my final comment, linking into the last set of questions, is that I think all these points we're making shows the requirement for a very strong ministerial team to be working on this to be appointed after the election, because it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of cajoling and a lot of prioritization to make any of these changes. And I think Meg's plea about can we come together on these things and get them done does require the right people being in the right place. And so I just hope that when the ministerial team is put together, they're going to be people with the status and the reach to be able to call time on some of the endless discussion and bring us to a point for decision.
And Meg?
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement on this as well. There's plenty of things that you can do to improve and reform Parliament. You can look at the committee system. I think it would be nice if the House of Lords had a legislative standards committee, for example, as the Hansard Society has recommended. I think that Darren's suggestions there on the Constitution, very, very sensible. But what we mustn't do is open this out in a sort of legislative way. I think even Nick Clegg saw that. He was ambitious on reform of composition, but he did not seek to shift the powers of the House of Lords in his bill, because he realized opening that up is a whole can of worms. So I think if we can do things procedurally, we should absolutely look at that. But there are some urgent things that need doing, and let's not overcomplicate things by trying to kind of fundamentally shift the relationship between the two chambers, or we won't get anything done.
Well, on that note, I think it falls to me to thank our speakers very much for joining us for this really interesting conversation, and thanks also to Hannah for fielding the questions. And given that this is the final panel of our conference, it also falls to me to thank everyone who's joined us over the last 2 days. Our wonderful speakers, our audience, and my colleagues Ed and Rowan for all their work behind the scenes, making this work so smoothly. You'll soon be able to find a video of this session and all our conference sessions on the unit's website and also on our YouTube channel. And we'll be releasing an audio version as a podcast soon, so do point others towards it. And join us too for our next event. On the 16th of July, once the dust has had time to settle, we'll be discussing lessons from the 2024 general election. And that's with Meg, Professor Alan Rennick, the UCL polling expert, Professor Ben Lauderdale, and Dr. Sophia Collignon from Queen Mary University of London. You can sign up on our website, and there's also a link in the chat. But for now, that's it from us. Thank you very much. Goodbye, and we'll hope to see you again soon.